Hello and welcome along to the industry analysis for the CIMA management case study of November 2019. Here we're going to be looking at the real world sportswear industry, and a fascinating industry it is, it has to be said. But before we get into the meat of the industry analysis, let me just address a quick question which is often raised by CIMA students, and that is, why are we doing an industry analysis at all? After all, we are presented with some industry information in the pre-seen document itself. Is that not sufficient? Well, first of all, let me say right off the bat that you are certainly not expected to be an industry expert by any stretch of the imagination. CIMA does not expect you to know all the ins and outs of the wider industry within which the company operates. Having said that, I do think that there are some very important benefits to doing a deeper dive on the industry than simply what you're given in the pre-seen document itself. And there are two main benefits on exam day from doing a deeper industry analysis. Firstly, it helps you to anticipate some of the potential issues that might arise in the unseen scenario, and thereby avoid surprises and nasty surprises and confusion on the day of the exam itself. Think about it: if you are preparing one of these CIMA exams, if you're one of the examiners and you're actually writing one of these exams, you want the scenarios that are presented to be as realistic as possible. And obviously, you want to get that realism from the real world industry. So it's very likely that the trends that are occurring in the wider industry are going to influence the kinds of scenarios that the company in the pre-seen encounters. After all, the wider business environment is going to determine what kinds of threats there are and what kinds of opportunities there are and various challenges that these companies are facing. So that's one very important reason, I think, why it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with what's going on in the industry and where it's likely to go in the coming years. Another reason I think it's important to do a wider industry analysis is because it is easier then to illustrate and apply your abstract theoretical knowledge by using concrete examples and specifics, both from the pre-seen document and the company itself, but also from the wider industry. And if you're aware of certain trends that are occurring, you can use then those trends to illustrate your points more effectively and more easily. If you're more familiar with the information about the wider industry, you can do that more quickly and more efficiently. On exam day, you'll probably have a better grasp of the concepts and ideas that tend to operate within the industry, and for that reason, you'll be able to illustrate and apply your knowledge more quickly and more efficiently. So before we get into the industry analysis, let me just give you a quick rundown of what exactly we're going to be looking at. Firstly, in section 1, we're going to have a general overview of various trends that are influencing the sportswear industry in terms of consumer trends, physical activity, and so on, some of the benefits and some of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in sports and physical activity in general. From there, then, we're moving into the sportswear industry overview. We're going to be looking at some key figures, some key trends in terms of quantitative analysis in this section, a bit more detail as well on consumers and what they prefer. Then in section 3, we're going to look at the manufacturing process in some detail, what happens when orders are placed, when it comes to sourcing fabrics, the actual manufacturing by third-party manufacturers, for example, and so on, and all of the different ins and outs of that process. And then from there, in section 4, we're going to have a little case study. We're going to be looking at two of the major sportswear brands in the world. Without a doubt, you're already familiar with them, and those are Nike and Adidas, really, really big players and very important companies to look at for any company operating in the sportswear segment, considering their size and their influence. At the end of the industry analysis presentation, you can also find sources upon which this industry analysis is based, in case you want to look at any of the distinct issues that are raised in a little bit more detail. So let's start with section 1 then, looking at sports and physical activity in general. It has to be said the popularity of sports and fitness activities in the last 10 to 15 years has grown rapidly amongst the general public. Rising cases of work-related health issues in particular, such as stress and obesity, are pushing more people to follow any sport and fitness activity. And indeed, with the rise of office jobs and office work and a kind of sedentary lifestyle, this is becoming more and more urgent. And of course, we're also becoming wealthier. This gives us more leisure time. And for that reason, we have more of an interest in actually taking up physical activity. It's further increasing the demand for trendy and comfortable sportswear. In addition, the growing popularity of international sportswear brands is also contributing to the product demand. We're going to look into that a little bit later on in terms of why brands are becoming so important and popular in this segment. Of course, you're probably already familiar with many of these, but it's worth just reviewing them for the sake of understanding the consumer, the benefits of regular physical activity, strengthened heart and cardiovascular system being one of the most important, of course, increased flexibility, increased joint mobility, increased muscle strength, stronger bones, improved stamina, lower blood cholesterol levels, reduced blood pressure, loss of excess body fat, reduced risk of various diseases, including heart disease, lower incidence of depression, and reduced stress levels. Really an absolute amazing range of benefits from regular physical activity. It really is a no-brainer that this is something that everyone should really be doing. And for that reason, unsurprisingly, especially in developed countries where people have more free time and more disposable income, it is now becoming the norm that people are regularly engaging in some form of physical activity to gain some or all of these benefits. Let's have a look now at the world's most and least active countries. Now, this might be quite a surprising chart for many of you, and indeed it did surprise me when I saw it, but of course you have to bear in mind that there may be very varying reasons for the physical activity involved here. I'll explain what I mean in a moment. So first we have China, then Japan, followed by Russia, South Korea, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Turkey, Australia, and then the United States coming in a little bit further down the list, India, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. Now, this chart doesn't actually explain the cause of these physical activity rates. And if you look to the right here, somebody walking 7,000 to 10,000 steps would be considered moderately active. So just walking alone long distances is considered physical activity in this sense. Now, you might think, for example, that you're likely to see higher rates of physical activity in the more developed economies like Germany, for example, or the United States. But we're seeing here at the top China, Japan, and Russia. China and Russia in particular would be considered perhaps emerging or developing economies rather than economies that actually already have achieved a high status in terms of income, disposable income, leisure time, and so on. So it may well be that a lot of this reflects a lot of physical activity in labor form, that is, in the kind of work that's being done. You might also, for example, have a lack of good transport, forcing people to walk long distances to get to their workplace. That would also factor in to this kind of analysis. So it is difficult to tell just from the raw numbers what is going on here, whether this is voluntary physical activity in the form of, for example, going to gyms and in people's spare time doing physical activity, or whether it's by necessity, out of economic necessity, for example, that there are high figures in places perhaps like China and Russia. But whatever it may be, the fact remains that China, Japan, Russia, and South Korea are the top in terms of physical activity, with the United Kingdom coming in 5th place. So that's where the activity is. But it does make a difference, I think, from the perspective of marketing from companies like the one we're dealing with, the pre-scene, GSC. It will matter a great deal what the actual explanation of these numbers is, because of course if a lot of the physical activity that's going on in China is attributable to, for example, workplace activity or traveling to and from work by foot, for example, then the likelihood that there's going to be a demand for sportswear in those countries is actually lessened, because of course they're going to be wearing their work clothes, and it might not be the case that the higher rate of physical activity will correspond to an increased demand for sportswear. So that is something to bear in mind when you look at raw numbers like this. Most popular sports by country then, perhaps unsurprisingly, soccer or football, depending on where you're from, is the major sport in terms of its global reach. You can see from this chart, the color-coded chart here, that football, soccer is ubiquitous around the world. Then you have countries, major markets like Australia and the United States, for example, where the national sports, Australian football and American football, are the most popular. But in general, you have to say that it is football and soccer that is dominating around the world, as you might expect. What about fitness trends for 2019? Well, there are a number of very interesting trends that I think are very important from the perspective of a company like GSC. Wearable technology, and this is something that is not really mentioned in the context of our pre-seen company, but it is a trend that is very, very important indeed. And of course, it raises the question, might a company like GSC look into the possibility of maybe diversifying, although I think that's probably unlikely given the expertise and technological expertise that's required to get into wearable technology. But perhaps they would look at partnering with another company that's specializing in wearable technology, some kind of arrangement to get into this market or to leverage this market and to improve their brand image. Another interesting development is group training. This is becoming much, much more popular, and that's particularly the case as well amongst females who are women who are looking to get involved in physical activity. It seems that class and group activities are much more popular amongst women than men, and women are taking up physical activity, formal physical activity, such as gym and fitness centres, much more quickly than men are. You have high intensity interval training as well, number 3, a particular form of physical activity, and this often does take place in a gym context. Fitness programs for older adults are also becoming much more popular as people in the older generations are looking to gain those health benefits that were mentioned earlier and that are so important. Then you have some other interesting trends here on the right. Bodyweight training is becoming more popular. Something called calisthenics is a trend in this area. If you go online, you'll see this, and you might often see this as well yourself on social media, for example. People using their own body weight alone to train, and some of the feats that these people achieve are quite impressive. Employing certified fitness professionals, of course, is also becoming more popular as people become more physically active. They're looking for guidance, especially amongst people who are novices, who might be getting into it for the first time. They will need some guidance when it comes to using, for example, gym equipment. Yoga as well is hugely popular, and indeed this ties in a lot with social media. We're seeing a lot more people getting involved in yoga, and often it seems to go hand in hand with a certain level of lifestyle choice and a kind of lifestyle and a philosophy that can be broadcast on social media, people trying to, I suppose, give the impression that they're enlightened and that they are very, very at peace with themselves and they're very civilized and so on and so forth. Yoga does seem to go along with a lot of those trends as well. Personal training, of course, this is covers a lot of different types of training, so not surprised to see that in there. Functional fitness training as well. This is the idea of training that is geared towards particular kinds of movements, geared towards particular kinds of physical activities and so on. That would include, of course, sports as well. There might be certain sports that you require strength in one area more than in another, and you want your training to be geared towards that or personalized towards that. And then exercise as medicine. Again, this goes back to those health benefits that were mentioned earlier on. Exercise is increasingly perceived as, by some at least, an alternative to conventional medicines as a way of addressing certain kinds of ailments. And of course, that may go too far, and people might think that exercise is a fix-all. It's a panacea that cures everything, but of course that is certainly not the case. But nevertheless, it does remain true that many people are seeing exercise as a kind of an extended form of medicine in the terms of maintenance and preempting certain kinds of diseases at least. So let's get into the sports industry overview, or sportswear industry overview, I should say. First, let's start with the definition of sportswear. Sportswear actually covers a huge amount of diversity. There's a lot in there, and sportswear, when you think of it first, you might just think of tops, bottoms, tracksuit tops, tracksuit bottoms, and jerseys, and then maybe shoes as well. But there's a whole lot more going on in the sportswear segment than you might initially think. It's clothing, including footwear, worn for sport or physical exercise. Obviously, that's the function, or that's the purpose. Sports-specific clothing is worn for most sports and physical exercise, and also for practical comfort or safety reasons. Typical sports-specific garments include tracksuits, shorts, t-shirts, and polo shirts. They're the kind of basics and the ones that would immediately spring to mind. But there are all sorts of other specialized garments, including swimsuits, wetsuits for diving or surfing, ski suits for skiing, of course, and leotards for gymnastics. You also have sports footwear, including trainers, football boots, riding boots, hiking boots, ice skates. You have sportswear, including bikinis and some crop tops and undergarments, such as jockstraps and sports bras. Sportswear is also at times worn as a casual fashion item of clothing. We're going to come back to that point later on because I think it is potentially very important indeed. But you can see the great diversity and range of kinds of apparel that falls within the broad category of sportswear. So huge scope there for diversification for companies that might be more narrowly focused on one or two particular kinds. Let's look at some of the key numbers from the industry. This is from the Technavio analysis. Sportswear industry is a lucrative sector for business. The global sportswear market is predicted to reach $184.6 billion by 2020. This industry has grown and is predicted to continue its growth at a compound annual growth rate of 4.3% from 2015 to 2020. So you can see the market is expected to accelerate at a compound annual growth rate of 5%. 36% of the market share originated from the Americas, not surprisingly a huge market there. The APAC region, however, has a higher incremental growth than, for example, Europe, Middle East and Africa. And one of the key trends for this market will be the technological advances in sports and fitness wear. And that, again, go back to those 2019 trends, and you can see wearable technology is right up there at number one in terms of the trends in sportswear. I guess you could call it sportswear because these are wearable technologies, but in terms of a company like the one we're dealing with in the pre-scene, the focus there really is more on apparel in the form of clothing that you can wear. But it is an interesting question whether or not there's room or space or potential for diversification, or perhaps for joint ventures and partnerships with existing tech companies who are already well established in that area. Perhaps acquisition is another consideration there, but we'll leave that to you to think about. Sportswear is becoming streetwear. I mentioned this earlier in one of the other slides, but I think this is a theme we need to come back to over and over again, especially when it comes to strategy. Sportswear fashion is rising in popularity. More and more people are becoming concerned with the gym clothes that they buy, as they wish to look good whilst they work out. And of course, social media seems to be feeding this trend and amplifying it. Sports brands include Nike and Adidas have been producing fashionable sportswear for a while now, adding to the hype of the trend and raising the bar of all gym lovers everywhere. Even fashion designers have latched on to the fashion performance sportswear trend. Stella McCartney started her lifelong collaboration with Adidas in 2004, leading to her designing of the Team GB Olympics kit for Rio 2016. In addition to this, musician Tiny Tempa recently started his own fashion sportswear brand called What We Wear. So fashion and sportswear are increasingly becoming inextricably linked. The market share by end user. This is a demographic breakdown in terms of male versus female. Consistent increase in male outdoor sports participation support the growth of outdoor sports apparel market during the forecast period. So we're looking here at particularly outdoor sports apparel market, which is perhaps distinct from, in many ways, for example, indoor sport apparel, which is primarily focused on gym wear. In addition, the market players have been launching lightweight and comfortable apparel for men in outdoor sports context. But you can see here the growth of male participation in the outdoor sports apparel market is projected to be quite healthy from 2018 to 2025, but there is perhaps even a larger growth rate amongst women, even though the absolute participation rates are lower amongst women, but the growth there is healthier even than it is in the case of men. So that is something to bear in mind as well. Key competitors in the global sportswear market, unsurprisingly, Nike is right up there at the top. The industry has seen many mergers and acquisitions as well in recent years. Key players in the industry include Nike, Adidas, Puma, and Under Armour, the United States brand, which is a relatively recent arrival on the scene but has made very strong inroads. However, Nike's brand value has historically been significantly higher than that of its closest competitor, Adidas. As of 2018, Nike was the preferred brand of US consumers when choosing sportswear. So here you can just get a visual sense of just how far ahead both Adidas and Nike are in terms of their share of, or not their share of the market, I should say, but in terms of their revenues. You can see here Nike out on top and Adidas coming in second place, way ahead of Puma and Under Armour in third and fourth spots. So in some ways it's a kind of a duopoly or duopolistic market, or at least trending in that direction. But certainly companies like Under Armour have made some interesting inroads and developments in recent years, and so perhaps the position of Nike and Adidas is not necessarily as secure as it may have been in the past. As one of the largest and most recognizable brands on the planet, it is of little surprise, of course, that Nike is the leader within its own industry of athletic apparel, accessories, and footwear, with sales amounting to around $35 billion in the period for June 2017 to June 2018. So one of the key markets in sportswear, unsurprisingly, is the United States. Sporting goods market in the US is $1 billion industry. Sporting goods store sales in the United States alone amount to more than $47 billion annually. This includes many different products types such as athletic footwear, exercise equipment, licensed sports merchandise, and athletic apparel, but does not include recreational transportation items such as bicycles, pleasure boats, RVs, and snowmobiles. The United States is the key market in the sports apparel and footwear industry, holding the lion's share of the market with 36%. So obviously there are some kinds of products mentioned in there which are not actually provided by the company we're dealing with in the pre-scene, but again raises interesting questions about kinds of diversification or product development that might occur in the coming years. Sales of sportswear in the US market, you can see the projections to 2020, quite healthy, fairly steady growth rates, it has to be said. Nothing spectacular or strange going on or anomalous. We're looking at a fairly linear growth pattern there year to year. Let's look at US consumer behaviour and indeed shopping preferences now in a little bit more detail. Some interesting points to bear in mind here. The share of people who have bought 2 to 5 sports apparel items in the last 12 months, I should say, is 44%. So that's not insignificant. That's about half of the population have bought 2 to 5 sports apparel items in the last 12 months. Then you have the share of people who shop for sporting goods in department stores, 55.2%. So that's, again, just a small majority, but still a majority of people who are purchasing their sporting goods in department stores rather than in specialized retail shops. The share of people who prefer to shop for sporting goods and fitness accessories at specialist stores then is at about 40%. The share of Americans who always buy sporting goods online. This is an interesting one. Only 3%. Now, you have to bear in mind, of course, the qualifier always buy sporting goods online. It is unlikely, of course, that anyone would always buy something online. Even in this day and age, it's much more likely that it would be a mixture of both physical stores and online purchases. So maybe don't read too much into that, considering the fact that it's always rather than sometimes. I'm sure sometimes the percentage is much higher. The share of Americans spending over $500 on sports apparel, this is at 9.1%, and this is an annual survey. And the share of Americans purchasing sporting goods then once per month is at 13.7%. So it is a healthy market in terms of how frequently people are purchasing sports apparel and where they're purchasing. For example, they're doing it mostly in department stores still. And the share of people who prefer to shop for sporting goods and fitness accessories at specialist stores is at 40%. So while in reality they probably buy most of their goods from department stores, there is a preference. That's an important point to bear in mind. A preference to shop in specialized stores. In other words, for example, places where you can get particular kinds of apparel for particular kinds of sports, but that would also include, for example, brand-owned stores like Nike stores, for example, would be considered specialist stores as well. So a not insignificant percentage of the population actually prefers going to those specialized stores. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, because of course they're likely to get more specialized attention there. They're likely to get more expert advice there, for example, if they're buying equipment or apparel for a particular kind of sport, like running, for example, or soccer, as it may be. And so that is not a surprising statistic either, but it is an important one to bear in mind. Now we look at favourite sports brands in the United States, and some interesting little points here to bear in mind as well. And this is looking at it from the perspective of male versus female consumers in terms of what they prefer in brands. Nike is much more popular, it seems, amongst men than it is amongst women. Not entirely clear why that might be the case. The same goes for Adidas, although to a slightly lesser extent in terms of the gap. And then Under Armour, much more men than women prefer Under Armour. That one is perhaps not surprising given the history of Under Armour's development. Under Armour started out producing undergarments for particularly American football players, and that was where it made its first kinds of inroads into the sportswear and apparel market, producing tops that were had special fabrics that wicked away sweat and heat, for example, and they were very practical for those kinds of sports where there was a lot of protection used. For example, in American football, you have the helmets, you have the pads, and you have the jerseys themselves, and that obviously can create an awful lot of heat. And these Under Armour tops, these thermal tops, were very effective at transferring heat away from the body of these athletes, and it was primarily in American football where it made its major progress in the early years. And so for that reason, it's not surprising that it's more popular amongst men, given the male participation rates in American football are much, much higher. Then you also have no favourite. This is an interesting one. Women are much more likely to have no favourite brand than men are, and so that might go some way to explaining some of these other discrepancies in terms of Nike and Adidas, for example, why more men prefer Nike and Adidas than women. It seems it's because women don't have as much brand loyalty as men do, and that is a very important thing to bear in mind when it comes to marketing. Brand loyalty appears not to be as important in the sportswear segment to women as it is to men. And then Reebok, 12 and 14%, much less difference there between men and women. And that is a curious one as well as to why that might be the case. But certainly it does seem that overall women are much less sensitive to brands and brand loyalty than men are in the sportswear segment, a very important marketing point. Teenagers then are another interesting demographic, and Nike is way out ahead when it comes to popularity of sportswear and apparel amongst teenagers, perhaps even more so than is the case amongst adults. You can see the percentage of US teens naming the following as their favourite apparel footwear brands in 2019. For clothing, Nike is at 22% compared to the next on the list, which is American Eagle, followed by Adidas, Forever 21 and Hollister. But then you've got footwear. Nike is absolutely dominating the teenage demographic, 41%, followed by Vans, followed by Adidas, Converse, and Foot Locker. And this, again, bear in mind, this is favourite apparel and footwear brands overall amongst teenagers. This is not just talking about sportswear, this is talking about everything. And Nike is dominating both in the clothing and footwear segments. That just gives you an indication of how well Nike has done from a fashion perspective in terms of people wearing these kinds of clothes just for their everyday purposes, not just for sports. So that is a very important point to bear in mind when it comes to Nike's dominance and how large a company they are. Top apparel brands then. This is looking at it in general. As we can see from this graph on the right, sportswear brands hold major share in the global apparel market. Nike remains the leader not only in sportswear industry but in the apparel industry overall. It's a little bit less exaggerated here in the overall adult market. This is not just for teenagers. This is adults, Americans aged 18 to 64. So the discrepancy between first and second place isn't actually quite as large, but still Nike is significantly out ahead, 51% versus the next biggest brand, which is Levi's, at 44%. So a 7% margin there. And then Adidas coming in third place, again perhaps surprisingly. So you've got two sports brands in the top four there, and then Levi's and Calvin Klein in second and fourth place respectively. So a really, really important point there, because fashion and sportswear are actually in many ways synonymous, especially it seems in the North American market. Most popular footwear then, again this is taking into account all the brands, not just sportswear, and we're looking at 18 to 69 year olds again. So this is not teenagers, this is everyone. And look at the number of sports brands that are in this area. We've got Nike, Adidas, New Balance could be argued is a sports brand as well. Skechers, Converse, Under Armour, again explicitly a sportswear brand. Asics as well, Puma as well, Timberland not so much, and Fila certainly has a history of sportswear production as well. So nearly all of the top 10 are sportswear manufacturers in the footwear industry. Here you can see Nike again way out in front, 47.3% versus 23.8% for Adidas in second place.